On Ghost Story, Al's ingenuity was really outstanding, although it didn't have too much to do with stuff built in the department. There's a shot in Ghost Story where there's a guy buried alive in a coffin. And the question always in scenes like that is, okay, we're photographing a guy buried alive in a coffin. He's 6 feet underground. Where's the light coming from? How do we photograph the guy? Al had a brilliant idea. He said, let's make the coffin out of plexiglass. Let's line the coffin with paper that has a wood pattern either printed on it or silk screened on it. And let's light the coffin from the outside so that the coffin is actually glowing in a subtle way. And so the light is coming from the coffin. You cannot tell where the light is coming from because it's completely enveloping. It's supposed to be printed very low. It was printed way too hot in the last time I saw the movie. But that was an idea of Al's ingenuity that went far beyond his skills as a painter, which were formidable. I met Al Whitlock because of a movie. I saw a very sort of disposable comedy called That Funny Feeling, which was Bobby Darin and Sandra Dee. This movie was set in Manhattan, and periodically they would cut away from the, to me, very obvious studio sets, and you would see these gigantic, amazing, very convincing shots of Manhattan. And of course, I understood that they were matte paintings, but I had never seen matte paintings of that quality before. Matte painting is a piece of art generally created in those days with oils and brushes on glass or masonite. And those paintings were combined photographically with backgrounds photographed on location to act as extensions of the sets, extensions of the location, to make it appear, for example, that the Universal backlot was in the middle of Manhattan. And it was Al Whitlock's name I saw on the screen, and it was Al Whitlock I called up the next day. And he answered the phone and talked to me, a complete stranger. And we became friends, and I went to visit him at the studio, and, fade out, fade in. 10 years later, I'm working for the guy. Universal had all the in-house departments still at the time that I came there. In fact, Universal had an in-house lace maker. There were matte departments at many other studios. Disney had a superb matte department headed up by Peter Ellenshaw, where Al had worked before he came to Universal. Al had the confidence of the executives at Universal, and they knew that he was capable of turning out shots, either fantasy or reality shots, that were the highest quality possible, that were completely deceptive, and basically extended the scope of the movie making that could be done at the studio. I was Al's cameraman. And so the first thing I did when I worked there is I went to work on the Hindenburg. So the first thing we did was we drove down to Santa Ana and rigged cameras on top of the big dirigible hangars at Santa Ana, 300 feet in the air, looking down into this camera. And my key grip, who I had just met a few weeks earlier, Larry Schuler's hanging onto my belt. So my vertigo, fortunately, didn't manifest itself when I was busy, and I was really busy on those shots. So that was my baptism of fire, was Hindenburg. We did something on almost every feature that came out of Universal. What they didn't expect was that shooting in the middle of winter in Woodstock, Vermont, there wasn't going to be any snow. And suddenly our responsibilities bloomed, just like the responsibilities of the effects department bloomed, because suddenly they had to snow in big swaths of actual live scenery that hadn't seen snow in a year. And that's a perfect example of how departments can work together, because the effects department would snow in the foregrounds and we would snow in the backgrounds, put snow on roofs, put snow on distant mountains and things like that. All these big vistas, the formula was the same. Special effects snow in the foreground, the loose stuff in the extreme foreground, then snow mats, basically big white blankets back into the distance, and then Al Whitlock in a big shot. We would snow in the roofs on houses. We would snow in the distant hills. We would put a foreboding sky in the shot, because those were all matte paintings. The painting has to be photographed and combined with the live action somehow. And that can be done one of two ways. It can be done with original negative, which is the method that Al favored. And in the original negative method, you basically put up a mat, a piece of black cardboard or black anything in front of the camera that prevented big sections of the scene from actually being photographed. The sections that you basically wanted to replace with painting. So now you have a bunch of film that is undeveloped and that has a big area of the frame unexposed, because that's where the matte painting is going to go. Then using test footage from the head end of the roll, Al looks at little tests back from the lab every day and creates a painting. The painting is tested that the painting is double exposed onto the film, onto the original negative film. And finally, when the painting and the scene match together perfectly, we take the good takes out of the refrigerator and expose the painting onto the good takes. That's the original negative matte painting process. And that has the highest possible quality because everything is first generation. There's no duping, there's no copying involved. Another example of Al's technical ingenuity that was used very effectively on Ghost Story. There's a scene where we see Alice Krige on the road, and as we drive toward her, her ghostly figure gets brighter and brighter and brighter in the headlights, and then suddenly she's inside the headlights, passing through the hood and coming right up to camera in a big scary close-up. How do you do it? Well, the way it might have been done typically is we would shoot Alice Krige on the set in front of blue screen, and I was hired because of my blue screen expertise. That was why I was hired for Hindenburg, because Al wanted to do blue screens in the department. But Al had a better idea. He said it's going to look more effective if she's really there on the road. If she's really there on the road, being lit by the natural gloom. And so here was Al's concept. On the camera car that photographed the background, which included Alice, he had the Grips build two big outriggers that were separated by a gap of about 2.5 feet in the middle. So if you imagine these two big outriggers, or two big booms sticking out from the front of the camera car, and on the ends of the booms are the Rolls-Royce headlights. Now, for example, if we were to drive toward Alice, she would be lit by these lights. Then she would pass between the lights as she came up toward the camera. Of course, that wouldn't be safe to do at speed, so we filmed the action in reverse with Alice close to the camera in focus, the camera car backing away, revealing Alice in the headlights, and then the headlights getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer as the car was further and further away. It's a typical example of Al Whitlock ingenuity producing an effect that I don't think anyone even considers. Because first of all, it's over very quickly, and secondly of all, it just seems unremarkable until you realize that she's really there, she's really on the road, and she's really being photographed by a live camera. And Al again was this fountain of ingenuity. Craig Wasson, very nice man. Craig Wasson has to fall nude from a building. Absolutely stark naked, and falls away and eventually breaks through a roof. So the background is a matte painting. The swimming pool that he falls through, the roof, the building isn't really there. And Craig, of course, was shot against blue screen. And again, he was shot on camera, pulling away as fast as we could, never fast enough, but as fast as we could, and frantically following focus. And so the question is, okay, typically, guy falling away from the camera, you hang him on wires. Well, he's stark naked. Can't hang him on wires. If you do, it'd be mighty uncomfortable. So Al came up with this very clever idea. He said, look, let's stand Craig on his right foot, I think it was, on a piece of mirrored plexiglass in front of the blue screen. The mirrored plexiglass reflected the blue screen, so it essentially disappeared. The only thing left to betray the fact that Craig was standing on anything was the reflection of his foot. So now let's support his other arm with a long tether and a little flesh-colored armband. So here's this actor, stark naked, standing on one foot with one arm in the air and one foot in the air, And now he can move his body and his arm, his body, in fact, he can move all his limbs with complete freedom except for one leg. So the result was, in these brief moments that you see these shots, he doesn't look like he's attached to anything. In fact, one person actually asked me, I guess this was after Alan Rickman did that wonderful fall in Die Hard. They asked me if we had actually thrown Craig into a blue screen pad, but no. And so that was again Al Whitlock thinking way outside the box. We did this whole poltergeist sequence. I didn't want the crockery that was being thrown around to look like it was on a wire or just being thrown through the screen. So I had the special effects guys make me up a plexiglass scoop that we could rest the crockery in before it was thrown, so it could come up into the frame actually under control, because it was under the control of an arm that was 6 inches away from the plexiglass scoop. So by rotoscoping the arm out, and the plexiglass scoop almost disappeared, it looked like these items were under control, under positive control, rather than being dangled by strings. And that stuff did work quite well, if I do say so. Again, the whole poltergeist idea was discarded, came out of the movie. So I first met Jack Cardiff on location in Vermont. I guess I was there the day before Al and the rest of my team got there, and so I was really looking forward to meeting him. Of course, Cardiff is like God to anyone who's into cinematography, and I was especially impressed by seeing the incredibly complex lighting diagrams of how Cardiff lit these big sets for Technicolor. And of course, they don't look like they're lit. They're just the work is so beautiful. So I said, oh boy, I'm going to see how the old guard does it. So they were shooting in a church that day, inside a church, and I got off the bus and I went inside the church and looked around, expecting to see a plethora of lighting equipment. But no, there were 2 of these Maxi Brutes inside, big 9 lights, and which were silked off with some tracing paper. And then there were 2 more Maxi Brutes outside shooting through the windows. I don't think there was any direct light on the actors anywhere. The Maxi Brutes inside were being bounced off ceilings, and the shafts of light from the windows were used as sources. And I realized that Jack Cardiff was not only keeping up with the times, he was leading the times. He was adopting the latest equipment that would help him do his job, the best Panavision cameras and lenses, the smallest, most portable lighting equipment he could find that would still get the result. And so I did not get my wish of seeing a 60 light interior setup, but I got to see how a cameraman who really penetrates to the heart of the scene works. And he was instantly approachable, just the most delightful man you can imagine. And because I knew about his films, he was, I had obviously done my homework, and so I was instantly accepted. And it turned out that he was very good friends with Al Whitlock. In fact, he had stayed at Al's house here in Reseda for long periods of time. And so Al and Jack were thick as thieves for a long time. So it was truly wonderful. Universal had a policy. I guess it wasn't Universal so much as it was the contract administration, had a policy that if you hired a foreign cameraman to work on an American movie, that was okay as long as you hired an American cameraman to sort of shadow him. And since I was already getting a paycheck every week from Universal, I got to be the guy that shadowed Jack Cardiff. And the opportunity of a lifetime. I learned so much sitting at that guy's right hand and just watching him work, and watching how he dealt with every situation, watching how he dealt with his crew, who were wonderful. He managed to get his gaffer over with him, And I learned so much about how you handle yourself on a stage with a director, with a crew, all these things that they don't teach you in film school. All these things that they don't tell you in books on lighting. But Cardiff was the whole package. He was the real deal, and basically everybody loved him. So when he had to say no, which was sometimes, he could say no firmly, and people would say, "Okay, Jack, we'll find another way. We'll find another way to do it." So he was absolutely wonderful, and we became friends and stayed friends until his death. When the shots were in progress, we would meet every day with the director and the editor, look at the film in the screening room at Universal, and make sure that our shots were going in the direction that he wanted. So that was the very good thing about Universal system, was the director was as involved as he wanted to be in post, and John Irvin wanted to be involved quite closely. I was excited about two people, Fred Astaire and Patricia Neal, and I got to meet them both, and I got to have little chats with them both. I just idolized Patricia Neal. I guess from HUD on, you realize that this was just an unbelievable special talent. And even in films that didn't use her to her full range of her skills, like in Harm's Way, for example, she's a wonderful presence. She really elevates that film, as she did Ghost Story, very small part in Ghost Story, and every film that she was in. She was absolutely great and very pleasant to me. Fred Astaire, I only got a chance to talk to once. We were on a location with Fred, and we were pretty much there by ourselves. It was a second unit shot. Fred was supposed to come walking up to the house in our shot. And of course, the special effects and the greens people had made very sure that there wasn't any ice on the path, and that he could walk carefully. He would walk down into the shot. He had to do this. I think this was an original negative shot, so he had to get 2 takes plus some test footage. He walked in a sort of age-appropriate way up into the house, and he just sort of skipped back to 1 between takes. I mean, he was really agile and very showed very few signs of his age. He was pretty old at the time too. We always shot with our own equipment at Universal because we knew that we could not depend on production cameras to be steady. Even the best production cameras from Panavision, let's say, were always optimized for silence and not for steadiness. So we had our own we basically had our own little camera department at the Universal Matte department. And I think we were the bane of the production managers who saw this whole extra set of camera equipment, coming in on the truck, and thinking, "Oh no, these guys are going to slow us down." Well, we never slowed them down. We were always the widest shot, so they would typically be working in front of us, with the close-ups, and then they would fall back, and we would get our matte shot for which we were set up 2 hours ago, and then we'd move on to the next. Shot. So it was a real advantage, but I don't miss photochemical photography a tiny little bit. That aspect of it, at least, where you had to be constantly worried about, was the camera steady? Was the film perforator working properly the day that particular roll of film was being made? Is something bad going to happen to the film when it goes through the lab? All these issues that, they seem almost comical when you talk about them with young filmmakers, because they're problems from another world, and good riddance. Never spent too much time watching him paint because I was busy in the other end of the department. Sid could tell you a lot more about how Al painted, but I'll tell you that he painted with a very simple palette. He only used 8 colors on the palette. The palette was not a mess of mixed paint. He worked very, very neatly and tidily. He always worked in a suit and tie. He never ever got paint on his clothes. When he got paint on his hands, it was a source of annoyance because it meant that he had slipped up somewhere. So he was a very, very tidy worker, and because he had this simple palette, it was completely repeatable. So he could come back the next day or the next week or the next month and get exactly the color that he had gotten before because he knew what all the components were. He used big brushes. The secret to his technique, which he learned from Peter Ellenshaw at Disney, who in turn learned it from Pop Day, was to paint like a scenic artist. They were all scenic artists, all these guys. Pop Day, Al Whitlock, Peter Ellenshaw. They were all scenic artists at one time or another. And if you don't paint, and if you've got a 100-foot wide cyc to paint, if you don't paint with a big brush, you'll never get done. Al would project a little piece of film onto the raw painting, which was usually just gessoed, a piece of gessoed glass or gessoed masonite, with a very simple outline and a lead pencil, and then he would start painting. And he would put in big masses with a big wide brush. He'd put in the sky with the widest brushes of all, and what's called fadding, which is to say blending in the sky impeccably from top to bottom. So there was a graduation in tones, usually from light to dark from top to bottom, but no noticeable lines or breaks or texture. And then he'd start putting in the big features. The skyline, for example, would go in with a big brush, just the roughest lay-in of the skyline. And then the trees, and then the houses, working progressively forward. The important thing for Al was to get the tone and color right. And when the tone and color was right, then you could go back in and think about, okay, we'll paint some branches on trees. We'll paint the architecture into the houses. We'll paint the detailed highlights and shadows into the mountains. But by working in that method, he was able, first of all, to work very quickly. He was able to work very consistently and uniformly. He didn't use a lot of paint. There was never any thick impasto. For one thing, in a matte painting where the lights are from the top and the bottom, if you put a thick impasto on the glass, that impasto will cast a shadow onto the glass. The ridges of paint from the brush will cast a shadow onto the glass. He didn't want that. He just wanted to see color. He didn't want to see any texture from the paint at all. Relatively simple set of brushes. And sometimes he would, dab a little bit with his fingers. Sometimes he would use his pocket handkerchief and dab a little paint on the painting. But a very tidy, systematic worker. And because of that, he could keep 7 or 8 paintings going simultaneously. We had one of the other secrets to Al's department is he had discovered a way to make oil paint dry overnight. 2 elements to that secret. You use a Japan dryer, a very hot, very fast dryer, and you physically dry the paintings in gently heated air overnight. So the next morning the paint is dry as a bone. You can paint on it anywhere without worrying about smearing the work you'd done the day before. And in that way he could keep 8 or sometimes even 10 paintings going consistently, progressing a little bit on each one each day. We'd shoot a little tiny 5-foot test through the lab on each painting every day to see how it was blending in with the live action. And in that way we were able to get a phenomenal number of shots done in a year, over a period of time. And of course some of the shots were mechanically difficult. There were a lot of shots sometimes that involved mechanical gags in front of the camera, animation in front of the matte painting camera. But most of the time, the animation was pretty simple. It was just to make the sky move. And Al had discovered, year after years at Disney, a very simple way of making the sky move by putting soft edge split screens in the sky and painting the sky over length. So the clouds in the foreground, which were usually at the top, the clouds of the foreground would move relatively quickly. The clouds in the middle ground would move slowly. The clouds close to the horizon, little or none at all. And thus a tremendously persuasive illusion of painted clouds moving in depth. And that was a trick. As soon as we got motion control and we could do repeat motion moves with cameras, we took that idea and ran with it, and did in 3 dimensions what Al was doing in 2. The typical paintings were pretty small. I would say maybe the glasses were 4 or 5 feet at most in width, depending upon whether they were 185 like Ghost Story was, or Panavision. Al would use a wider glass or a wider piece of masonite. Later at Illusion Arts, as the raw stock got finer and finer grained and the rough details of the painting became more and more obvious on screen, we got bigger and bigger until finally our paintings were about 8 feet wide on masonite. And but at the time of Ghost Story, that wasn't the problem that it became, as the lenses and the raw stock got so sharp. Unfortunately, the scenes that I'm most proud of didn't make it into the movie. Universal wanted to make an adult horror picture. Of course, 1981, Exorcist is still ringing in their ears. Everybody wants to make another Exorcist. Best-selling novel by Peter Straub, a director with impeccable credentials as a serious filmmaker. After they had tested the movie and discovered that it hadn't scared enough people to death, they decided to put in a lot of cheap shock effects. They already had Dick Smith, who had done a couple of very, very effective horror makeups that were just seen very briefly, and so they were really horrifying. But they had Dick Smith, so they said, okay, make gruesome stuff. So they wrote new scenes. We shot a bunch of Dick's full figure horror effects in front of blue screen to mat into backgrounds already shot. You know, it didn't work. There's always a place for a good cheap shock, but not in that movie. It's the wrong movie. It's a movie full of interesting characters, I think very well established characters. They didn't have the courage of their convictions. They forgot why they hired John Irvin. They forgot why they paid a fortune for Peter Straub. And the result was a movie that was neither here nor there. It didn't have the sort of what I would call dreadful, in the literal sense of impending dread, of dreadful horror. That's the equivalent. That's the visual equivalent of the book.
I will take you places where you have never been. I will show you things that you have never seen. Alma?
You can see that matte paintings are still tremendously important in visual effects. Especially, distant scenes are very often, typically, the product of a matte painting, and sometimes the product of a single brilliant artist. There are artists working today like Michael Pangrazio, Chris Evans, as good as anyone ever. Every once in a while, someone comes along like Robert Stromberg, who's now a very well-known director. But Robert was one of our guys. He was one of our artists, and a fantastic artist. Learned everything that he could learn from Al Whitlock and from Sid Dutton. He won 2 awards for production design in quick succession, the first one being for Avatar, and then moved on to directing with Maleficent. Not only did he direct Maleficent, but he and his colleague Justin Brandstatter painted 200 matte paintings in Maleficent.